This episode is powered by denmeditation.com. Though meditation is the primary focus, the bigger goal is for people to understand and love themselves, thus creating more harmony in the community at large. To find out more about Den Meditation's teacher training programs, retreats, and all things Den Meditation, go to denmeditation.com. Welcome to Den Talks Podcast. This is Tal, your host and the founder of Den Meditation. I have something really cool for you guys today. We're talking to a shaman, but not only any shaman, we're talking to a sangoma. That is a South African shaman. And what I love about this, he is actually a white South African shaman. He was the first to actually be allowed and be brought into this culture and trained. This is not something you go to school for. This is something you have to be asked, initiated, and apprenticed. And so you have to work within the tribe. You have to work within the lineage. I think he trained for over 10 years with his teacher. What I also love about this story, it was really bridging gaps through culture, through color, all things we can really learn from, understanding suffering from all aspects. He grew up in South Africa during apartheid, and he was also part of it as Nelson Mandela became president and things started shifting. So he knows a lot about acceptance. He knows a lot about suffering. He worked as a medic in the army. He's seen some tough things, but he has such a beautiful take on life. It really is incredible talking to someone who is living their purpose to the fullest. Also, I really behoove you to stay tuned to the end. His personal practice is otherworldly. He takes out his drum. And again, he is a sangoma. This is what they do. Part of their lineage is dancing and trancing. And so when he takes out his drum and starts doing these chantings and leads you through this heartbeat meditation, I promise you energy moves and changes. I was transported and I thought it was unbelievably incredible. So definitely stay tuned for that or make sure you get it in. Let us know what you think. Hope you enjoy the episode. We were talking off recording about, things coming into your life at times you don't necessarily ask for them when you kind of let go of that idea. And you were mentioning that on the spiritual side, that's the same thing. It's almost sometimes when you ask too much for something, and you said the spirits almost say like, you want too much from me. And it's when you kind of can let go, things come. I want you to dive into that a little bit more because I think it's interesting. This idea, I feel like it comes both ways. If you actually want something in the physicality, like if you're looking to create or manifest something, but also if you're growing in this evolution spiritually and you're kind of wanting more, like, hey, I wish I could be, I wish I had these quote unquote powers that my teacher has, talk about a little bit of that, this outward wanting and longing and pulling in, and how that actually, from what you're saying, kind of, hinders your growth.
That's a great question. I think that's something we all face it somewhere along the road. We all have a sense of lack or a sense of we want either a partner or we want to have that mystical dream or those mystical powers so that our life is a little bit easier. And but the interesting thing is that wanting and that grasping is off-putting for the other, whether it's a spirit, an ancestor, a divine being, or just someone who is a potential partner. That neediness is something that we have to all face to a certain extent. Like I say, whether it's neediness with love or neediness spiritually, or even neediness because you want a job and you're desperate, you have to feel that neediness inside and do your prayers, welcome in your ancestors or your angels or your guides, and then center yourself and feel the joy of being alive. Feel the wind, feel that you are enough as you are. And all of us have a relationship with a great mother, with nature, whether we are connected consciously to that or not. All of us are children of nature. All of us are children of planet Earth. And just that basic connection to being an animal on this planet and connected to nature, we can just tune inwards, feel our heartbeat, look at the wind, look at the stars, or look at the sun, and do a prayer. And if you're feeling that neediness or you're feeling you want something badly, just to be aware of that, but then also being aware of letting go and of feeling that you have everything you need right now, and then connecting more deeply to your heart And, it's interesting. It all sounds very, and listening to myself talk like this, and I think, okay, that sounds very easy. But what happens if you're really suffering? And I've encountered people who are suffering. I've encountered myself and my own suffering. When you're pulling your hair out, you're looking for answers. And in those moments of extreme suffering where you feel there's no answer and you're desperate because you want to look for a partner, or you're desperate because you're looking for meaning in the world, in those moments is when you also have to let go and just take a breath and know that this life is sacred and anything is possible. I had this frightening experience recently with a loved one where they started to choke, and they were choking, and I was actually half asleep, and they came to me and they were just choking, and fortunately I've studied CPR and I've got some kind of first aid training, and part of me just completely went into autopilot, and I just did the Heimlich maneuver, and everything was okay. And I remember sharing the story with my mother, and she was saying that a friend of hers, his mother, lost her life in the same way, that she was in a restaurant and she was choking on a fishbone, something as simple as that. And she died. There was no one to give her the Heimlich maneuver. And then my mom said something very wise to me. She said, all of us are just one heartbeat and one breath away from the other world. So we are that close to the other world. So when you are suffering, you have to feel, what are those things that you do have going for you? There is going to be something, because the great mother, the nature, is looking after a sparrow in the tree. And if nature is looking after a sparrow, even in the height of winter, where it gets minus 40 degrees in some places, the great mother is going to be looking after you as well. So there needs to be an element of trust. And I know my Zen masters in South Korea used to say that all practice requires three things: great trust, great courage, and great determination of, why am I alive? Don't know. Why do I eat every day? Don't know. But that question of grasping and that question of wanting is such a huge thing in the world today because of massive consumerism and what I term hungry ghost energy. This hungry ghost energy is like eating up the planet. And the only way for us to help that and save the planet is for each person to feel they are enough, put their hand on their heart, breathe, and just let go.
I mean, that's beautiful. I have so many things to say from that. I know when you were working, I loved when I was reading in your book and you were talking about working with your, Zen masters in South Korea, that question, and they say it so jovially, like the question of like, why do you want to live or something, or why are you living? And they're like, you got to figure it out because it's important. Live with purpose, basically. And it's really struck me. It was that moment of like, that's a big question. Like, wow. And it's true. If you actually ponder it and think about it, I think a lot of us would make a lot of changes in finding those answers.
So in terms of suffering and in terms of finding your purpose in life, I remember one of these teachers, it might have been Ram Dass or some other master, guru, yogic master. And the person was asking the teacher, how do I find my purpose? How do I find my destiny? And they were kind of asking and pleading. And eventually the teacher just said, well, I don't know. Maybe you haven't suffered enough. So this question of suffering, it's not like life isn't suffering, but as the Buddha would say, life is suffering. And we have to accept that, because part of that suffering is this grasping and this wanting. There's incredible suffering with that. So I remember with my story, which I wrote about in my book, Leopard Warrior, everything changed for me when I was 18 years old and I was in the South African army as a medic. And there was a war on in Angola for about 10 years. So it was equivalent of the Vietnam for us in South Africa. A lot of young men were conscripted and drafted into the military, and I was one of them. And we had a war that went on for about 10 years. And then when I entered the military, it had just ended like a few months previously. So I was working in a military hospital, and we were dealing with the aftermath of the war. So there's a lot of soldiers that were coming for rehabilitation and for healing and for operations and everything. And I had the sense I'd already received dreams and already received certain callings and inspirations. And when I had to go to the military, I was allowed to choose what area of the armed forces to go in. So I chose the military, the medical corps, because I felt I wanted to learn about healing. And if I was sent to the front lines, I'd rather go as a paramedic and as a medic to help. So I wanted to learn the art of healing. And in the military was actually very good that way. We learned an incredible amount. And so in this military hospital, I was given all different specialized units that I'd work in. So I was in rehabilitation, I was in orthopedics, and I wanted to learn more about the deeper aspects of coming close to death and of suffering and things like that. And I couldn't articulate it because I was so young. I was only 18, but I wanted to be in intensive care or be a paramedic. So I applied for that, and those places were taken. So they put me into the neurology ward, which was like another ward just off intensive care. And I remember that's where I learned some major lessons, and that's where my calling actually started, because I had this patient who was in a coma, and he was just a few years older than me. And every day his mother would come to me and say, is my boy going to live, or is he going to die? And of course I said he's going to live, but he was in a coma and he was in a very, very bad way. And I knew that he was dying. And it was one of the hardest cases that particular neurology ward had experienced in a number of years. And the senior medics gave me the job of doing the last observations. So I was feeling his heartbeat beneath my fingertips. And then I was dealing with his mom. And then they decided to turn off the machines. And I felt his heartbeat fading. And I was very traumatized, but I was also angry because I felt that his suffering was too much. I felt his suffering was too much. And in that moment, just before I left his room, I prayed to everything that is holy. I prayed to the divine, I prayed to God. And I said, please show me another way of dealing with healing, that if I'm ever in a situation like this, that at least I can speak to the mother and I can connect with his soul, with his spirit, and bring about some healing, some like a balm for the wound of the soul, something like that. And because I said, this suffering here is not correct. Something is not right here. Please teach me another way to deal with suffering. And I prayed so strongly. And then I left his room and I came back a few days later from leave, and his room had been cleared out. He had gone and he had passed. And then 2 weeks later, a friend of mine came to me and said, I'm starting Zen Buddhist classes. And I said, what is Zen? And he said, well, Zen is a practice of meditation, and it's Buddhism, and it speaks about suffering. And the Buddha says all life is suffering, and we have to understand that, and then we can leave that cycle of samsara, of suffering, and then we can make a decision to come back and help others or not. But it's accepting that main premise that life is suffering, and then really focusing on that until it dissolves. And I said, okay, that sounds about right for me. So I enlisted in these Zen classes, and that was the start of my journey, and then the start of my dreams. So I think the reason why I'm sharing this with the listeners and with you, Tal, is to say that we all have suffering, but there's a pivotal point where everything changes for us. So the question for everyone right now is, what is that pivotal point for you where you've experienced extreme suffering, whether it's your suffering or a loved one, or it's death, or it's illness? There's a point where we accept our mortality, and there's almost a point of anger inside of us where we feel this is not right, or I need to come to the grips of something and I need to get some help. And then you open yourself up to the Dharma, to the teachings from the universe, and then things change.
It's so interesting because, in your book, you do say that was a quest for you. Like you even said it to the masters, like, explain to me, I want to understand suffering. And it's funny because you had been around a lot of it already in your lifetime, being from South Africa, being part of, living in apartheid, seeing people that you cared about suffer, then becoming a medic. You'd seen a lot of suffering. So what was your search looking for? Was it to understand why suffering even existed in the first place? Was it to understand why one must suffer? What do you feel like? What was the missing piece for you that you were trying so desperately through your studies, at least in the beginning, to try and understand?
I suppose, I was so young, I couldn't really articulate it. But now looking back, I think it was just the suffering of being in South Africa with incredible inequality, and also feeling ashamed to have white skin because of the brutal treatment of Black people around me, and feeling this complete inequality that was basically brutal. And then at the same time, being very empathic and very intuitive and very sensitive, and then seeing the suffering of animals, and then seeing the suffering of these soldiers that I was looking after, and who had just come from this brutal war in Angola, and just nothing made sense to me. But I felt that the answers were there. I just needed to ask the right questions and meditate. And that's how my journey really started, because in my first retreat, my first Zen retreat, I was still in the military, and one thing about suffering I can just share with everyone, and everyone probably knows this already. You know this, Tal, but when you've had enough, everything in life in terms of the passions and joys and intoxications that we have around us that can get us out of ourselves, nothing was enticing me. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll were not enticing me. So the meditation was the only thing that gave me relief. So when I meditated for those 4 days for my first retreat, I meditated like a soldier, and I was very ardent, and I just very focused. And then after that is when I got my calling dream to become a sangoma. And in that dream, I was approached by a witch doctor, because I didn't know the sangoma world. I just knew the negative connotations.
Can you just explain to the audience what a sangoma is, for those who may not know?
So a sangoma is a South African shaman, a traditional South African shaman. So there's a difference in the world with shamanism. There's traditional shamanism, where you go through an apprenticeship and you have to be identified by the lineage and by the elders, and then they invite you to be an apprentice. So that's what I went through. And then you also have core shamanism, where people do shamanic practitioners courses and workshops, and they learn the art of journeying and things like that. And that's core shamanism is more connected to contemporary shamanism in the world. So sangomas are traditional shamans, and during apartheid, during the 60s and 70s and 80s, and going back in history, the English and the colonizers used to see these traditional healers or traditional African shamans or sangomas, they used to see them as witch doctors, and they labeled them as witch doctors. And the term can seem a bit negative, but it actually means doctoring the effects of the witches. So witches are seen as negative. So even with the term witch doctor, there was a positive, even though it was a bit derogatory sometimes. It was seen as people who could deal with negativity and heal the spirit. So that first dream I had, I just dreamt about this traditional Xhosa witch doctor That's the term until I learned about sangomas. And we were in a cave, and I speak about this in my book, Leopard Warrior, and we were lying down in the traditional way, and then I started to speak to him via mental telepathy with my mind, and I asked him to please teach me about suffering and how to heal suffering, and teach me about nature, and help me learn these ancient ways. And next to me was another apprentice. He was a black man, and the two of us were equal, lying down on the ground. And it was very real. It was like, I'm looking at you right now. It was even more real than that. And then he started to speak to me. And he said to me, in my culture, he said, in fact, sorry, I go back. I asked him 3 times to teach me, and he kept quiet. And then after the 3rd time, he started to speak to me. He said, in my culture, to learn these ways means that you're going to get very, very sick, and you're going to come close to death. And that's the way it is in my culture. And then I said to him, I'm already close to death, and I've seen so much suffering, and I've just put my beloved dog down who was sick, and I'm only 18 years old. And I said, my life is already over unless I learn these ways. So he kept quiet, and then he gave me an image of the future, of what was going to happen. And I accepted what he said. And then he started to teach me. And then the next morning when I woke up from the dream, my whole body was covered in boils, my legs. And it was very, very strange. And I went back to the military hospital that I was working in. And I went to the emergency ward, spoke to one of my medic friends, and then they got a doctor to look at me. And I had contracted tick bite fever. And it was mysterious because all the friends I'd gone with on the retreat, none of them had received tick bite fever. I was the only one. So that was the first illness I had. And then I had one illness after the next for 7 years. And I'd have these physical illnesses, and my body would get very sick, and it would be a confirmed illness, so it would have been hepatitis, tick bite fever, dysentery, all these illnesses I had. And at the same time, I would have all these psychic experiences at night where I could see the future, and I was taught things. And it was only when I met my teacher many years later, my Xhosa teacher, that she explained what was going on. And when I went to the nearby museum of my hometown, I saw an old image of a witch doctor in the 1800s, and it looked just like the man who came to me in those first dreams.
Whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So you're telling me, I didn't get this part from the book, that you, up until you met your doctor, you didn't quite put together the illnesses that you were having with kind of like, this is an initiation into where I'm headed. Because like you said, they all had legitimate, sign. Had you, or did you know, like subconsciously were you like, okay, this is what I have to do, this is what's happening? Or were you like in human form, like, what is happening to me? Why am I so sick? And just trying to fix it?
I think a bit of both, because I did realize there was something happening to me, because the dreams were very clear, and they also predicted things. So I was told, for instance, to go to South Korea and study Zen, and that it was going to be very important for my destiny and for my future. And then I was told and shown things that were going to happen, and they did happen. And then when I was invited to become a Zen monk and join the Zen school that I was in South Korea, I said no, because I wanted to go back to South Africa, vote for Nelson Mandela, and then also explore the sangoma calling. And I didn't have an expectation of becoming a sangoma, but what I wanted to do was to meet up with a sangoma and have a divination. And that's what I did. And on that first divination is when my teacher to be explained what had been happening to me. So the night before I met her, Mam Gwevu, she had a dream from the Great Spirit, she said, where the Great Spirit said to her, "You're going to train someone to become a sangoma, a senior sangoma like you, and you need to prepare yourself because this person comes from a different culture, does not come from the Xhosa culture. You need to prepare yourself for this."
And then here you are, all tall, white, and blonde,
I know.
walking
And then the
in.
next day, I went through her gate, and she didn't put one and one together yet because she was just sweeping the yard. And then my Xhosa friend said to her, "We would like a divination." So she thought, well, maybe it was, my Xhosa friend. But then she thought, maybe then what's the white guy doing? And then when he sat down, he made it clear, no, it's for the divination's for me. And then she was like, oh my goodness, and then the dreams started coming. And then when she started doing the divination, she went into trance and the ancestors went through her. And then she spoke really accurately about the last 7 years of my life. And then at the end, she said, "You're the one that I dreamt about." She said, "Will you be my apprentice?" I was like, "What?" I said, "What does it mean to become a sangoma? What does it mean? Because I've just heard these terms, witch doctor, and during apartheid and all these derogatory things." And she said, "To become a sangoma means you're going to stop being so sick, and the ancestors are going to be able to work through you in different ways. And you're going to get stronger, and you're going to be able to heal people in all different ways." So I closed my eyes and I said, "That sounds good." And then her husband came in and said, join us, become Mamgwebu's apprentice." And I said, "Okay, I'll join you." And then she said, "Great, we'll come tomorrow and I'll give you your first white beads, which will be a sign that you are my apprentice and you're on the journey to becoming a sangoma."
And didn't she say something to the effect too of, because is it faso? So how do you call being sick until you like the sickness you have leading up to your calling? What is it called?
It's called the Twaza
Twaza.
illness.
Sorry, I said it incorrectly. Twaza. So didn't she also say, since your Twaza is so strong, you'll actually be like a higher level apprentice, like you're coming in?
Yes, well, I have to go through all the stages like everyone, but she said, you've survived on your own in the cold, she said, for all these years. So she said, you're going to be one of my senior apprentices because of what you've gone through on your own without support. And but I have to go through all the stages from being a junior going up. And so I said, thank you. And that was it. So then 10 years, we trained together for 10
Wow.
years. And I'm still very close to her, still work with her in South Africa.
So it's, if let's say someone, I mean, it's so interesting because for you too, it was also cross-cultured. I mean, what I found so incredible about your story, which I think is something we can talk about in a broader sense, is your dreams were potent even before you were a medic. It sounds like you always seem to have more potent dreams even as a kid, correct? That made it really clear that you weren't not cut out, but you weren't one who wanted the traditional things that, a white South African normally would want. So it feels like you'd been very strongly guided from a young age. But talk about, do you feel like there's other people who are strongly guided like this that just don't even realize it and don't follow it? Like, I just found it so amazing how strong your intuition was, how strong the voices were, how strong your dreams were. I mean, your dreams were potent even before you started doing any training. And I know that dreams a big part of your shamanic practice, is a big part of sangomas, right? Dreams are one of the main, ways. So do you feel like it's because you were always meant to be part of this lineage, or you were always part of this lineage, and so that's why dreams were so potent for you? Or talk a little bit about it. I just found it very fascinating.
Yes, well, we say in the Xhosa culture, in the traditional Xhosa and Zulu culture in South Africa, we say that a sangoma is born. You're born as a sangoma, and the decision for you to become a sangoma is before you're born. And this is what happened to me actually, because my mother's Irish from Dublin, and she used to walk along the pier in Dunleary, which is near Dublin, and one day she was walking along the pier, and it must have been the 1950s, and she just had a sense of all these African elephants. and she felt that she needed to go to Africa and see the elephants while they're still wild and free. That's the sense she had. So she packed her bags, got a transfer from her work, and went to Zambia. And then she went to Zimbabwe, and that's where she met my father. And it's interesting because in my family, my Irish family, my grandmother was a great seer. My mother's mother, she was a great seer, and she had incredible dreams. And she actually predicted the end of apartheid. And she told my mother about that, the dreams she had. So in the Irish culture, dreams in that old Celtic way, it's very real, and it's very strong in my family, and it's very strong in the Irish family, in the Irish lineages. But it's strong in many different cultures. This gift of dreaming, it's strong in many indigenous cultures. And when I see clients from around the world, I see it strong with Irish. I see it strong with the French. I see it strong with the Israeli and the Jewish culture. You see it in cultures that have that intact connection to the old ways and ancient times, and it surfaces in mysterious ways for people. So yes, my destiny was preordained, before, as my mother had that vision. She left Ireland, and then I was born in Africa. And one of the reasons also is because these old indigenous ways in Ireland have been broken. Those old lineages where someone can be apprenticed to become a shaman have been broken. It was broken for maybe 1,000, 2,000 years. Whereas it was still alive in Africa, and it's still very strong in Southern Africa. So I feel that I had to go through this traditional training and see the similarities between the Irish and the Xhosa, and then help people, help people from Irish, English, Swiss, German, help people connect with their ancestors in these ancient ways based on my training and what I've experienced. Because at the end of the day, no culture and no person is better than the other. Each culture and each person has gifts and technologies and wisdom to share with another person and to share with another culture. So in this way, the Xhosa culture is very developed in terms of spiritual indigenous technology. And this is what they apprenticed and trained me with. And in so doing, I'm helping people in the West with spiritual poverty. And in so doing, I also have a fund, and I have an Ubuntu fund, and then people help me financially sometimes, and then I help my friends in the township where they're dealing with physical poverty. So this is the way we help each other. Spiritual poverty in the West is very, very serious. In some ways, it's actually more serious than physical poverty. And I have experienced both. I've experienced physical poverty with friends dying of AIDS, experiencing terrible, terrible physical poverty in South Africa. And I've also experienced clients who are absolutely depressed and are not connected to their dreams and their ancestors, and who are experiencing terrible, terrible spiritual poverty. And both is terrible, physical and spiritual. But spiritual poverty is not something that we speak about. And I want to raise the flag and say it's real and it must be addressed. And that's why I'm on the podcast with you, because you, Tal, are dealing with your community and you are helping people deal with spiritual poverty, through the work that you are doing, which I think is beautiful, and it's very commendable, because spiritual poverty is something where we need to go to the soup kitchen of the soul, and that's what you're offering with the Den meditation.
We'll talk about that a little bit more, how you see spiritual poverty, how you see it coming out through the cracks, what you see, the ramifications of it. Also talk about it from a perspective of a shaman who feels things. Like, I know you do trances and you sense things. So when you work with someone that you can feel might be a little disconnected from their ancestors, disconnected from their spiritual side, what does that feel like for you?
Well, a big part of it now is what we shared earlier, is this grasping energy, which I call the hungry ghost, where someone doesn't feel that they are enough. So the way they cover that up is through maybe buying things, and then going on the internet and searching and searching and searching and buying and not feeling that they are enough, and then also maybe going to spiritual teachers and wanting those teachers to fill that void inside of them, and then even maybe fighting with a teacher and saying, hey, I was here, I've spent all this money for this session, but I'm not receiving anything. And then they get cross, and then they go to the next teacher and the next and the next. And it's very sad, but the only way to heal that grasping, hungry ghost or that spiritual poverty, the only way to heal that is for each person to feel their own wanting, their own neediness, their own grasping, and then make a prayer to the Great Mother, to nature, to your higher self, whatever is divine for you. Feel your breath and feel that you are good enough. You are just as good as the sparrow in the tree. And if anything, we need to learn from the sparrows because they can survive all weather conditions. How do they do that?
How do they do that?
That's the question. How do they do that?
But talk about that a little bit, because, through all of the ceremonies that you've done, through your initiations, through ceremonies you continue to do in your own practice and your own leadership, talk about, in a very simple way, not how you talk about it, but how there is a simplification when you do actually connect in that deeper spiritual way to the ancestors, connecting to nature, understanding that you're part of something bigger, how energetically it changes. Like you've talked about how sometimes more of the chaos leading up to an initiation or ceremony is actually a good thing, because it means like the energy is just so intense and high. Of course, it's causing things to move, and how like you might enter ceremony and it starts, like calm, clear skies. And then by the end, it's like pouring rain. Talk about just how simple, when let's say that hungry ghost doesn't exist and you become more like the sparrow, how big things can be through such simple action.
Well, what starts to happen when you start to become more like the sparrow in terms of connecting to your indigenous spirit, connecting to your intuition, to your empathy, to that human, I call it human intelligence. When you're connecting to that emotional and spiritual human intelligence, what starts to happen is you see the world not in a linear fashion. You start to see the world like an indigenous person, or the way we used to, where things is a little bit more circular or spiral in terms of time. And what I mean by that is, once you have a spiritual experience and you feel full inside, time stops in some ways and it opens. There's like an expansion starts to happen, which I talk about like entering like a fourth dimension, or entering the dream time, where you hear and you conscious, like right now I'm here, I'm conscious, I'm looking at you, I'm talking to you. But because of the experiences that I've had, I feel that this conversation we're having can go in any direction. It's not just a linear experience. And another thing I need to share is that once you have a strong spiritual experience, or even dip your waters into the spiritual pool, maybe through doing a wonderful meditation, or maybe you do a trance dance and you just let go and surrender, or maybe you're swimming in the sea and suddenly you just feel that your ego drops for a moment and you feel this expansion in your spirit. One of those experiences would be, in my experience, was having like a very mystical dream and waking up from the dream and feeling like I'm a billionaire, like literally feeling like money is no hindrance. Money is no hindrance because I'm a billionaire. So actually literally feeling that I'm so abundant inside that I can go in any direction, forwards, backwards, that the physical world in terms of money is no longer trapping me. So those are one of the things that I personally have experienced. I mean, of course, I'm not silly with it. I do see the limitations with money, but that experience in your heart where you feel like a billionaire and you feel full inside, Those are one of the things that start to change you as you go along this journey.
Talk about the element of trust in your life, because again, you've made, you left, you were studying psychology at one point after you got out of, the army, and you left in the middle of an exam because, you were getting all these visions and voices basically saying, you have to go beyond the words, you have to learn beyond the words. And you couldn't actually come up with the words to answer any of the questions, which I thought was such a heavy and huge statement where I was like, oh shit, do we all need to do that? Is that a little bit of what you're talking about, this, spiritual poverty? Is it the fact that we don't know how to go beyond words? Like, we don't live in symbols. We don't live in dreams. We don't live in understanding beyond words. Like, I found that statement that happened to you in that moment. And so you got up and left, a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and you must, it's a huge deal actually. So basically, I was receiving intuitions before that exam that something major was going to happen to me. And the more I studied the books, the more the words in the book didn't make sense. And it didn't make sense in an intellectual way. I mean, it wasn't intellectual because I was doing well at my studies and I was good with words. But it was like, the meaning behind the words was evaporating. It's like there's all these words on the page, but there was no meaning for me anymore. And as the exam came closer and closer, I was experiencing this more with my meditations at home. And I was getting more anxious because I felt something was going to happen to me. And then finally, when I was sitting in this exam, it was an English exam actually, I saw the questions and I started to answer, and like all the meanings and the words, everything just evaporated. It just didn't make sense anymore. And I was also receiving a message before that I had to explore the world beyond words and that the words were going to dry up for me. So I was already received this intuition that something was going to happen. And then the exam, I started to write an exam and I wrote three answers and I just couldn't get the words, and that's when I got up and I left the exam room and I didn't go back to university for 2 years after that. And in that time I went to South Korea and I also practiced very strongly with my personal Zen master. And I explained all this to him in my Zen interviews. And he said, this is the first step along the road. He said, where the words dry up. And he said, now you have to start looking for real words. He said, what are real words for you? And I think this is part of the spiritual poverty that we're experiencing in the West, is that it's two things. Most people are attached to the words and the meaning behind the words. And you see this with social media, and you see this in every aspect of Western culture. And that means that there's huge misunderstanding between people, and that misunderstanding leads to aggression and can lead to violence. And sometimes not necessarily violence physically, but violence verbally. And it's because people get attached to the words, and they are so attached to the words that there's no other way, and then they misunderstand each other. So this is part of the spiritual poverty that is rampant nowadays, is people get attached to words. And then the other thing that happens, people are getting attached to what they see with their eyes. And the eyes are deceiving, because if you look at the senses, all our senses that we have, 7 senses, the one sense that is being overused right now is the sense of our sight, because we are scrolling on these devices and smartphones, that we are believing everything we are seeing, but we are being duped and we are being manipulated. And a lot of people are not aware of this. And then they're using words to try and make sense of it, but the words are not making sense either. So they're trapped almost in this another realm, the realm of the hungry ghost, And the way to get out of this poverty consciousness and the spiritual poverty, is to close your eyes, close your mouth, and allow the third eye to open, the eye of truth. And every spiritual tradition known to man works with that. If you believe everything that comes from the mouth, from your own mouth and the mouth of the teacher, then you might go astray. You have to go beyond the words, and you have to go beyond what you see with your eyes. Because like me, for example, people look at me and they'll say, he's not an African shaman. But white skin, look at me. But if you close your eyes and you hear me drum and sing, you will know that you're in the presence of an African shaman from South Africa. You will know that. And then you open your eyes and you get a shock. And then you are tested. The Great Spirit will test you just like many other people. And that's part of what's going on here, because when my teacher apprenticed me, she said she was being tested by the Great Spirit. And then after being with me for a few years, she said, I thank God, I thank the Great Spirit every day that I accepted to train you. Because together we have learned so much. And I said, yes, Mama, I've learned so much from you. And we are teaching other people. Don't get attached to what you see with your eyes, because it's going to deceive you. You have to learn to see with the eye of the heart, beyond words, and allow the third eye to open and the eye of the heart to open. Then you can see the truth, and you can get out of this trajectory of hungry ghost and spiritual poverty.
You know, it's so interesting because one of the things I love about your story is it's not just, look, someone who trusted themselves, trusted the visions, trusted the dreams, trusted the messages, and just went for it and became fulfilling your destiny, and therefore healing the planet, healing people, and really doing beautiful things. It also represents, and I think that was part of your name, that you were given this beautiful bridge of cultures, which is, I think, definitely part of healing humanity right now and healing the planet, where especially it's so specific to the time that you did this, which I know a lot of younger people won't understand what was going on in South Africa with apartheid, and how you really, to, even though it had ended not that long when you started doing this, 4 years before you started doing your training, for you to be entering a Black culture like that and a community daily and all the time, it was a huge deal. You know, it was a big deal. And that's why you said, like, for your teacher to even say, like, I'm glad I accepted, this, because it wasn't clear cut either. Because here, like you said, here you come in blonde, white, tall, like, just don't, you don't with the eyes fit in, but clearly you were meant for this whole thing. It's so beautiful. Talk a little bit about this idea of how, I mean, I know you believe in more. So what do you think it was about you coming into this world at this time, and why it was more than just you needing to become a shaman? You chose this coat of white and, to be like this. So what do you think part of that purpose is and was, and how have you seen the effects?
Well, I think it's about healing, really, because I remember the first 5 years was really difficult. And then there was a pivotal moment, which I wrote about in Leopard, where I was at a ceremony and I was just about to leave the ceremony because I felt all this hatred on me, And, for the listener, maybe some people have experienced this, but, when you feel incredible hatred towards you, when you've done nothing wrong, it's a very hard thing to experience. And you might say it's justified because of what's happened in South Africa, but, I'm innocent. I've done nothing wrong in my life in terms of hurting other people, and my parents are as well. But at the same time, I remember when I came back from South Korea, I remember that I was being trained to be a bodhisattva, which means to help suffering. And I also felt that with the first few years, yes, I did experience the hatred from folks. And I felt it was understandable because of what people had gone through. What Black people had gone through in South Africa was horrendous. And so it made sense that they would project a certain amount of that on me because they didn't know me. And as soon as people got to know me, then the relationship changed and there would just be this incredible love. But in the beginning, there was just this projection on me because of the color of my skin. They didn't know John. So I could forgive it to a point. I could forgive it. And then at one point, it might have been 4 years into the training, I'm not sure, I had experienced probably too much, and it was just too much. I was getting so upset because it was so physical, this hatred, that I started to get up to leave the ceremony. And in that moment, I looked at my Xhosa teacher and she met my eyes. We looked at each other and I knew she felt what was going on with me, which is mental telepathy. And then she just looked at me like this, as if to say, wait. sit down. So I sat down, and it was her time to talk. So she stood up and she spoke, and she shouted at everyone. She just said, "In the sick up, egazini bomf, in the sikanina, egazini bomf, in the sikatringulendava, egazini bomf, abantu bafana, ngamanye amaxesha, izinyanya amaxhosa bazukuthetha ucingo lwendaba. Ngamanye amaxesha, abalungu izinyanya bathetha mna, abantu bafana." So she would say, "If you cut my arm, red blood flows. If I cut your arm, red blood flows. If I cut John's arm, red blood flows." Sometimes John dreams of the Xhosa ancestors, and they come to him and teach him. Sometimes I dream about the white ancestors who come to me and teach me. Underneath the river of man, the ancestors move and they teach and help each other. Above the river, we are fighting. She said, "Tinglundaba is the sun in my home. When he's in my home, he helps me. He does whatever he can do, and he treats me with respect. He is my son. And when I go to his home and meet his parents, his mother and father show me great love and great respect. Tinglundaba is not just my apprentice. He is the son of my home."
And
So after that, things changed, After that, there was like, people realized that they were projecting hatred onto me, and it was not correct. They realized that they needed to see beyond the color of my skin, that here's a human being that is suffering as well. And this person can't help that they've got white skin. But what is joining us together is this red blood. And we need to go beyond what we see with our eyes and feel how we are connected with one another through our humanity. So that's the teaching, that's the crisp teaching that we all have to always remember when we dealing with conflict between people, whether it's political or social or whatever it is, that there's something binding each of us that is so fundamental and so incredible. And I remember going overseas and giving a divination to a man in Oxford. And it was a man who was actually originally from South Africa. And I gave him a divination through the bones. And then he got so excited because he said to me, what I said in the bones with my divination was the same as this wonderful sangoma that he's worked with for many years in Soweto. And I ended up working with that sangoma, a few years later. But the next thing he said to me was so incredible. He said to me, during the apartheid years, I did all the demonstrations against the apartheid government in London. And he said that he struggled with white people. He struggled with what was going on, And then one day he was on tour. I think it was in Sweden or somewhere. And he had come back from Mozambique, and he had contracted malaria, and he got very, very sick. And he was in this airport, he said, in Sweden, and he just collapsed. And the next thing he remembered, he was in this ambulance, and these Swedish guys were talking, and they were just saying, "We have to find his blood type. We have to find his blood type. And we've got 30 minutes, and otherwise we might lose him," because he was so sick with malaria. And the next thing he remembered waking up 3 days later in this hospital in Sweden, and his life had been saved, and he was okay. And then he remembered talking to his sister, who was a nurse, and he went back to London. And his friends were joking that he was no longer a black man. He was a white man because he had white man's blood inside. So inside he was now a white man, and outside he looked black, but he had all this white blood that had been transfused inside of him. And he said to me, he was so worried about this that he spoke to his sister, who's this nurse, and he says, this is what the brothers are saying, that now I'm a white man inside, and because of all this blood. Is that true? Is that true? And he said his sister was laughing. She was so hysterical with laughter that there was no sense that came out of her. Eventually she said, "Therefore, Blood is blood.
Blood.
It doesn't matter what color your skin is. Blood is blood. And he said this was a pivotal moment for him because his life had been saved by white people. And he said that that hatred he had from before, it just dropped. Suddenly he was much more compassionate because his life had been changed and saved by the efforts of these people who weren't black people.
Right. And it's interesting because you talk about in your book too, when you were a medic, how you had that one, was it a sergeant? I don't remember. Black man who did not trust you in the beginning, was actually very
Yeah,
reticent because he didn't trust white people, understandably. And
yeah,
then he said, I've been paying attention and you're not racist like these other assholes who are here. And
yeah.
like you, right. And you've actually been treating us all really kindly. And from now on, like it was almost like your first welcoming into that culture in an area
Mm.
that was really, again, I want people to remember what was going on in South Africa. It was very divided. And so to have that kind of welcoming, it almost felt like it was your first like hand reaching over and like allowing you to take a step.
Yes, yes. A few things happened during that time, and that was when I was helping to rehabilitate soldiers. And these soldiers weren't your average soldier. I mean, these were special forces soldiers, and some of them were very, very, some of the best some of the best special forces soldiers in the world at the time. And they'd seen a lot of action, they'd seen a lot of fighting, a lot of death, and I think that was part of the lesson for me at the age of 18 to go beyond, to go beyond the color of, to go beyond what I see with my eyes and to go beyond language and just to feel someone's spirit and their body language. And I had enormous respect for these guys because of what they'd gone through. And I just tried to help them. And then they, in turn, were very beautiful towards me in various ways. And I have one story around that, which I have shared in the book as well, but it's quite an interesting story because one day, I don't know what inspired me, but one day I asked the guys in the ward, because there were different wards. Within the ward, there are different rooms. And because it was apartheid, you would have one ward and everyone would be given the same treatment, but there'd be different rooms allocated to, say, black guys and then white guys and so on. But everyone got the same treatment in the military, which was wonderful. But this particular room I went into every day, I asked them if they had any good dreams. And to this day, I don't know why I asked that question, but I went in and I said, good morning, guys. Did you have any good dreams? And everyone was quiet. All these hardcore soldiers, special forces, they're all quiet. And I'd open the curtains and the sun would come in. And then I thought, okay, well, there's no one saying anything. So the next morning, 7:00, I did the same thing. Good morning, guys. Did you have any good dreams? Everyone was quiet. And then the third day I went in and I just thought, okay, I just got to do it one more time. Something about the number 3, I opened up the curtains. I said, good morning, guys. Did you have any good dreams? And then suddenly there was a voice at the back of the room. There was silence, and then there was this voice. And it was from one of the sergeants. He was he was an incredible man, Sergeant Ndlovu. And he said, medic, come over here. I want to speak to you. So it was this commanding voice, So I went to his bedside and I said, yes, Sergeant, sir. How can I help you? Now, and that was correct because I'm a private and he's a sergeant, and he's an incredible, he had an incredible reputation. So I was very respectful. And he said, medic, he said, in my culture, dreams are very sacred. When I dream, my ancestors tell me who's going to live and who's going to die in my platoon. I tell my men, your ancestors are calling you. Some of them laugh at me, but they still die.
Mm.
He said, in my culture, dreams are very sacred. Please don't ask me again whether I've had any good dreams. Now, he was becoming a sangoma. He was a Zulu man, and he was going through the initiations to become a full sangoma. And I know that because all the black nursing staff came and they gave him gifts every single day. They gave him gifts because of their respect for his calling and for who he was. And so he gave me my first sangoma teaching. That was my first sangoma teaching. And that's when I realized there was something happening to me. And this was before my dreams.
It's amazing how you beautifully guided you were. It really is incredible. I mean, I love it. Every piece. I mean, the fact that you had a sangoma there while you were being it's just all the pieces are so incredible. Talk about when you started to notice like your healing hands, for lack of a better word, when your hands started creating heat and the energy could go through you and you knew you could direct energy and help heal. When did you start noticing that?
I think that was when I was in the army, and I started to feel like just uncomfortable, and there was all this heat. And I had a dog, a beautiful dog, a bull mastiff that I loved to bits, and she had hip dysplasia, and we'd have to give her paracetamols because of the pain that she was in. She had hip dysplasia, and then I would just put my hands on her hips, and I feel this heat going through my hands, and then she would, after a few minutes, she would just start licking me, and she was in better shape, and she'd go running off. So that's when I knew there was something going on, you know.
That's amazing. So that was actually before all your training. I didn't realize that. You know what we didn't even really get to talk about today, so I'll have to have you back as a separate topic, is really just ancestors and why they're so important to connect to and the lineage of which you come from. But one thing I found fascinating, and we can talk about it another time though, is how you said often people don't connect to the maternal lineage.
Yeah.
Which I was like, that's so interesting. Do you know why?
I think it's because of our history in terms of the world. You know, the world has become very patriarchal.
Yes.
And we can blame and we can look into the reasons, but it could be because of religion. It could be because of, you know, women were feared. You know, if you look into history, and when I studied psychology, we did a history of psychology, and the history of psychology really started with science, and science started surfacing at the same time. The witches were medicine women, and they were threatening the power of the men because they were traditional healers and herbalists. And then there was this terrible thing happened in Europe where women were burnt at the stake because of their gifts of seeing and working with traditional medicine. And it created a real scar in humanity. So there was, I think, well over 1 million women who had been killed, you know. And this is one of the reasons why traditional folklore in Europe died out, but it continued in places like Africa and Australia and Siberia and other places, because the wisdom keepers were killed, you know. So this is something we can never forget as Caucasian people and as human beings. So this split between male and female happened, in the Bible, they say it happened in the Garden of Eden, but you know, that's kind of a metaphor for what actually happened. And the truth of it is more horrific than we can imagine. And how we can heal it, and the way we heal it is when we're doing our ancestral practice to honor your mother's line and your father's line. So that's it, you know, in a simple way, because we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but we can talk about it another time.
Yeah,
but just in a simple way in your own life, whoever's listening to this, just feel your mother's line, feel your father's line, and know that you are a product of not just the patriarchal line, but you are a product of your mother and your father. And in some more indigenous countries, like, say, Mexico, they will have their surname double-barreled. They will have mother and father in their surname, which I think is beautiful, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. And we definitely have to talk about it because that unlocks a whole different part of people's healing, which I think is really fascinating. But I'm so appreciative of your time. I would love if you could do a small practice for us, like 5-10 minutes, even if it's just like even the heartbeat meditation or something you can tell people what to do. You've been so generous with your time. This has been really lovely because your story is fascinating and you offer so much to people. And it's such a beautiful reminder to listen to the voice. You're a beautiful, beautiful energy. So I appreciate you sharing it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
And now John is going to do a personal practice, which is going to be a heartbeat and an ancestral meditation with a drum.
So, firstly, before we start, I just want to invite everyone to connect with their hearts. So, you're sitting up straight, feel your heartbeat. So, put your hand on your heart and just take a few deep breaths into your heart. So, really feel your beating heart and allow yourself to let go. Don't be in a rush. Don't worry about time. Just do this for a few minutes. So, let yourself go. Surrender to the moment. So take a few deep breaths in, directly into your heart. Feel your spine, feel your stomach, feel your belly. So sitting up straight, feel the crown of your head as it stretches up towards the sky. Breathing in all the way from the crown of your head, and just above the crown of your head, just stretch up like a tree. Breathing into your heart. And when you're breathing out, breathe out all the way down into your belly and below your belly into the ground. And then this time when we're breathing in, I want you to breathe in through your nose, really opening up those nostrils. And when you breathe out through your mouth. Make it a hot breath, just to release any tension, any exhaustion, any sadness. And then again, breathe. We'll do this 3 times. So breathe in through your nose, into your heart, feel the beating heart. Fill your breath, fill your body completely with the breath. And when you breathe out through your mouth and just make it a hot breath, releasing any exhaustion and any sadness. And now the final time, breathing in through your nose, full breath, full inhalation. And when you're breathing out, open your mouth and just releasing any heaviness, any sadness, any exhaustion. Just breathe out through your mouth. And now breathing normally through your nose or through your mouth if you've got a blocked nose, just breathing normally, feeling your heartbeat. And I want you to feel what starts to happen when I bring the drum in and I start chanting in Xhosa. I want you to feel what starts to awaken inside of you. But before then, just feeling your own heart and your own being. And I invite you to, in your mind's eye, welcome in your ancestors from your mother's side. So in your mind, have a sense of turning to your left and welcoming in your mother's people with grace and dignity. And as we think about the last conversation and we think about the split between male and female, that in fact is the biggest conflict we have in the human race. It's not between black and white, it's between male and female. And as we heal that within ourselves, then it becomes easier to heal the other splits we have in the world. So welcoming in your mother's people with grace and dignity, saying their name, welcoming them into you. And then in your mind's eye, turning to your right and welcoming in your father's people with grace and dignity. And now I'm going to bring my drum, my isikubo. Feeling your breath, feeling your heart, and forgiving yourself for for anything that you feel you feel guilty. Welcome in the Great Mother, ask for forgiveness. Don't judge yourself, being aware of the inner critic, and be gentle with yourself. Here we go. Abazali bamo, abazali bamo. Volen lela manyange, 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 volen lela manyange. Tamagwini yamanyange, tamagwini yamanyange, tamagwini yamanyange, tamagwini yamanyange. Volenle labazali bamo, 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 volenle labazali bamo. Tamagwini yamanyange, 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 tamagwini yamanyange. Breathe. Breathe. Volenle labazali bamo, 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 volenle lamanyange, volenle lamanyange, volenle lamanyange, volenle lamanyange. Volenle labazali bamo, 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 volenle labazali bamo. Amagwini amanyange, amagwini amanyange. Tamagwini amanyange, tamagwini amanabatala, tamagwini amanyange. Breathe into your body. Feel your body. Feel your breath. Know that you are alive for a reason. You are alive for a purpose. Your work is to find your purpose. Your job is to find your purpose. Let go and surrender. And your destiny and your purpose is right there in front of you. So feeling your feet, feeling your heartbeat, feeling the life force as it's moving through you. Know that this moment is sacred and your life is sacred. So thank you so much.